There comes a moment in life when you look around and realize that most of your exhaustion doesn't come from the responsibilities you carry, but from the people you keep trying to please. You explain yourself to avoid conflict, to seem polite, to be understood, to be accepted. And yet, every explanation chips away at your authority. Every attempt to justify yourself bends your spine a little more. You end up apologizing for things that don't require apologies, defending decisions that were no one's business, and shrinking your power one explanation at a time. Stoicism, and later, Machiavelli, understood this deeply. They taught that the moment you stop explaining yourself, you reclaim the throne over your own life. Most people believe explaining yourself shows respect, but there is a difference between respect and submission. Respect is mutual, submission is one-sided. When you constantly explain yourself, you communicate something quietly but powerfully, that you need someone else's approval before you can move. Marcus Aurelius warned that the opinion of others has no jurisdiction over the soul unless you hand it over. And Machiavelli added that the more you defend your intentions, the more you reveal your weaknesses. Explanations are cracks people look through to evaluate you and judge you. There's a reason powerful people remain silent, not because they are hiding something, but because they know the value of scarcity. They understand that when your thoughts and intentions are constantly on display, people grow comfortable taking advantage of them. Explanations make you predictable. Predictability makes you easy to control. Stoics sought inner freedom by refusing to tie their peace to public perception. Machiavellians sought external power by refusing to reveal their internal strategies. Together, these teachings form one of the most potent psychological shifts a human can make: to act without seeking validation. Look back at your life. How many times did explaining yourself change someone's mind? How many times did your explanation calm the conflict, silence the gossip, or make someone treat you better? Rarely. Explanations do not change minds. They simply feed someone's illusion that they deserve answers. Once you begin handing out explanations, people start expecting them as if they are entitled to your reasons. This is why Stoicism preached that the wisest move is often to say less than you feel. At some point, you must learn that not everyone is worthy of your truth. You must protect your inner world with a kind of disciplined privacy. You do not need to justify your dreams, your boundaries, your choices, or your peace. You do not need to unpack your trauma for someone who has not earned the right to hear it. You do not need to explain your ambition to people who don't have any. Silence is not evasive, it is strategic. Silence is not weakness, it is a shield. Silence is not a lack of confidence, it is the highest expression of self-respect. When you stop explaining yourself, something profound happens inside you. Your self-worth no longer comes from the shifting winds of public opinion. Your decisions begin to feel rooted and intentional. You start trusting your own judgment instead of the temporary reactions of others. This internal shift radiates outward. Your presence becomes stronger, your energy becomes more grounded, and people begin treating you differently without you saying a single word. Your silence speaks for you. This transformation is not about arrogance or isolation. It's about living in alignment with your values without performing for the world. Stoicism teaches the discipline of mind. Machiavelli teaches the strategy of influence, and both point to the same truth. The less you explain, the more others assume you know exactly what you're doing. Your silence becomes a canvas where others project strength, competence, mystery, and authority. Today's message is the beginning of your liberation from the psychological trap of over-explaining. This is your shift from seeking approval to commanding respect. This is the moment you reclaim your narrative. And as we move into the introduction, you'll understand why your silence, not your explanations, is the most powerful language of all. There is a quiet, unshakable power in people who move through the world without feeling the need to justify themselves. They don't announce their every decision, they don't broadcast their reasoning, and they don't waste energy trying to make others comfortable with who they are. This type of person commands respect without raising their voice. They influence without forcing. They gain authority without fighting for it. And the reason is simple. When you stop explaining yourself, you signal that your life is governed by your own judgment, not the external approval of others. Stoicism calls this inner sovereignty. Machiavelli calls it controlled perception. You are about to learn both. When Marcus Aurelius wrote that, "The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if they know nothing of the subject," he was reminding us that explanations only matter when the listener is qualified, and most are not. Yet we still waste enormous emotional energy trying to justify our boundaries, our decisions, and even our healing to people who do not understand our path. The Stoic life demands that you live according to reason and virtue, not applause. And that means letting go of the compulsive need to explain what you owe to no one. Machiavelli approached this from another angle. Power is weakened the moment it tries to convince. Explanations are a form of persuasion, and persuasion signals uncertainty. When you defend yourself, you look smaller. When you overjustify, you appear insecure. When you talk too much, people think you're hiding something. Machiavelli emphasized that silence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity creates influence. A person who doesn't explain themselves becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is a form of psychological leverage. This may feel uncomfortable at first. Most of us were raised to over-explain. Why we're upset, why we're unavailable, why we said no, why we changed direction, why we're not who people expect us to be. We were taught to perform our reasoning like a show for the audience, but the Stoics saw this as emotional slavery. The more you explain, the more you tie your inner life to external reactions. And once you become dependent on external reactions, you're no longer living, you're performing. Your life changes the moment you realize that explanations rarely serve you. You do not owe people access to your insecurities. You do not owe them a defense of your growth. You do not owe them a play-by-play of your choices. The only thing you owe anyone is integrity, and integrity requires action, not justification. When you begin living this way, people start paying attention. They sense something different about you. The noise decreases, and your presence becomes sharper, clearer, more intentional. This doesn't mean you become cold or detached. It means you become selective, purposeful, strategic. You begin choosing where your energy flows and who receives it. Stoicism teaches that inner peace is protected through healthy boundaries. Machiavelli teaches that power is built through controlled expression. Combined, they create an identity that is grounded on the inside and respected on the outside. You will notice that when you stop explaining yourself, weak people get uncomfortable. They demand reasons. They accuse you of being distant or difficult. They want your explanations because your explanations give them control. Strong people, however, will notice something else: self-respect, certainty, discipline, the ability to act without needing permission. And those are the people you want in your life anyway. As we move into the chapters ahead, you will discover exactly how to master this transformation, how to stop over-explaining, how to hold your boundaries, how to develop Stoic emotional control, and how to apply Machiavellian strategic silence. By the end, you will understand a profound truth. The world treats you differently when you stop explaining yourself. You stop being seen as someone who needs acceptance and start being seen as someone who leads themselves. Silence is one of the rarest and most misunderstood forms of strength. People assume noise is power, loud opinions, long explanations, emotional outbursts, but true authority comes from measured restraint. The Stoics knew this intimately. Marcus Aurelius wrote that silence is a lesson learned from the many sufferings of life. Silence is not emptiness. It is sovereignty over your reactions. It is the refusal to let anyone drag you into emotional chaos. It is the act of choosing peace over impulse. Strategic silence is not passive, it is deliberate. A person who explains themselves too much leaks power. Every explanation is a surrender of privacy, a surrender of inner ground, a surrender of emotional advantage. Machiavelli believed that leaders must retain an element of mystery. The more predictable you are, the more easily you can be controlled. Silence disrupts predictability. It makes others question your motives, your intentions, your limits, and in that uncertainty lies influence. There's a well-known story about a Roman general who was mocked by political rivals. They expected him to defend himself publicly, to justify his decisions and retaliate loudly. He refused. He said nothing. His silence was unsettling. People didn't know whether he was planning revenge, preparing a counterattack, or simply indifferent to the noise. The rivals eventually backed down, not because he fought them, but because they feared what his silence concealed. Silence became his weapon. Strategic silence doesn't mean you suppress your truth. It means you choose who deserves access to it. People often ask questions not to understand you, but to evaluate you, measure your weaknesses, or use your vulnerability against you. The Stoics taught that the wise do not speak to be heard. They speak only when it serves a purpose. When you adopt this principle, you stop seeking consensus and start cultivating inner clarity. What happens when you stop explaining yourself? You regain your time, you regain your dignity, you regain the ability to evaluate situations calmly without emotional manipulation from others. People begin noticing your shift. Some become unsettled, they no longer receive the explanations they used to extract from you. Others become intrigued, they sense your growing self-respect. And the right people begin treating you with more care. Silence filters your environment. There's profound peace in knowing that you don't have to respond to everything. You don't have to react to every provocation. You don't have to justify every no, every boundary, every pivot in your life. Silence creates space for wisdom to rise. It slows impulsive reactions. It allows you to observe others more clearly, who they are, what they want, and how they attempt to influence you. Silence is psychological clarity. Strategic silence also builds emotional resilience. When you resist the urge to over-explain, you confront the fear behind it, the fear of being misunderstood. But here's the truth Stoicism teaches: being misunderstood is not a threat. It is a sign that you are no longer living for the audience. Machiavelli would add that a person who fears being misunderstood becomes easy prey. A person who embraces it becomes untouchable. The moment you stop explaining yourself, you step into a new identity, one that speaks less but means more, one that acts more and seeks approval less, one that others observe with respect, curiosity, and caution. This is the foundation of self-command, the ability to direct your life without broadcasting your thoughts. Silence, properly used, is the birth of power. There comes a point where you realize that your life is not a committee project. It is not a group decision. It is not something that requires the approval of peers, parents, coworkers, or strangers. Stoicism teaches that your chief responsibility is to your own reason, your own virtue, and your own soul. When you constantly explain yourself, you abandon that responsibility. You start tailoring your decisions to match expectations instead of truth. Your first duty in life is to yourself, not in a selfish way, but in a disciplined, self-governing way. If you do not govern yourself, someone else will. If you do not define your path, others will define it for you. Machiavelli warned that the person who allows themselves to be guided by others becomes powerless, easy to manipulate, easy to confuse. The person who stands firm in their conviction, however, becomes a force that no external pressure can sway. Explaining yourself often comes from guilt, fear, or insecurity, emotions that signal you're abandoning your internal compass. But the Stoics believe that external approval is a shifting, unreliable foundation. What pleases one person displeases another. What impresses one crowd offends another. When you live for external reactions, you fracture yourself, constantly trying to satisfy an ever-changing audience. Your responsibility is not to entertain the world, it is to anchor yourself. Consider a sculptor carving a statue. If he asked 100 people for feedback, the statue would never be finished. Each opinion would demand a different direction. This is how many people live. They begin shaping their lives one way, then someone disapproves. They try again, someone criticizes. They adjust again, someone else offers an opinion. Eventually, the sculpture of their life becomes a disfigured mess of external expectations. The Stoics argue that you must be the sculptor, and the only voice allowed in the workshop is your own. When you stop explaining yourself, you enforce a sacred boundary. My life is mine to shape. You reclaim the authority to make decisions based on reason, not reaction. You gain the courage to say no without a story attached to it. You begin prioritizing what strengthens your character rather than what pleases the crowd. Your responsibility shifts from avoiding disappointment to pursuing integrity. This internal loyalty builds confidence. Confidence is not loud, it is quiet certainty. It is the sense that your life has an internal direction that does not change with criticism or misunderstanding. Marcus Aurelius taught that a person aligned with their purpose becomes unshakable, like a rock hit by the waves, battered on the surface but unmoved at the core. When you stop explaining yourself, you become that rock. Machiavelli would add that people respect those who stand firm. Even your critics are forced to acknowledge strength when they see it. The person who needs approval weakens their position, but the person who stays committed to their path gains psychological leverage. You begin to command respect not because you demand it, but because you live in a way that leaves no room for doubt. Your responsibility to yourself is the highest responsibility you will ever hold. When you stop explaining yourself, you make a declaration not to the world but to your own spirit. I choose my direction. I trust my judgment. I honor my purpose. From that moment forward, life begins aligning with you rather than dragging you behind it. Reactions are the currency of weak people. The more you react, the more you give away pieces of your power. Epictetus warned, any person capable of angering you becomes your master. Machiavelli echoed the same idea from a different angle. The one who controls your emotions controls your behavior. When you stop reacting impulsively, you reclaim your position as the strategist, not the puppet. You stop letting others dictate your internal weather. You stop giving free access to your peace. Consider how quickly situations escalate when someone wants a reaction from you. They poke, provoke, criticize, or insult because they're fishing for emotional information. Your anger tells them your weak point. Your defensiveness reveals your insecurity. Your frustration exposes your wounds. But when you don't react, when you remain unreadable, they get nothing. You become a wall they can't climb, a safe full of locked drawers. There's a reason the Stoics trained themselves daily to meet life with calm neutrality. Marcus Aurelius told himself repeatedly, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Not reacting does mean you don't feel. It means you don't hand your emotions to those who don't deserve them. It means you are the one who decides when to express, when to respond, and when to stay silent. That is strength. Think of an argument you've had where your emotional response made things worse. Your reaction may have been justified, but did it help you? Or did it give the other person ammunition? Now imagine responding with absolute calm, like your emotions were made of stone. Imagine watching the other person exhaust themselves while you remain untouched. That is the shift from reactive to strategic. That is Machiavellian composure. A king does not explain himself to a peasant. He also does not react to every insult. Your inner world should be a fortress, not an open field where anyone can wander. When you react to everything, you allow chaos into your gates. When you don't react, you become untouchable. That psychological distance makes people second-guess themselves. It makes them wonder what's going on behind your calm expression. It makes them fear underestimating you. In modern life, the one who doesn't react immediately is always at an advantage. In negotiations, relationships, conflict, and work, the one who keeps their emotions hidden holds the power. People begin to respect you even if they don't know why. You seem more stable, more confident, more capable. And most importantly, they realize they cannot manipulate you emotionally. That changes everything. Not reacting doesn't mean withdrawing from life. It means responding on your timeline with your strategy and with clarity instead of impulse. When you allow silence and pause to be your first response, you gain information while the other person loses control. Stoicism gives you peace. Machiavellianism gives you strategy. Together, they give you dominance over your own mind. The moment you stop reacting to every provocation, you break the chains that make you emotionally predictable. You become harder to read, harder to shake, harder to control. That is where true presence begins, when people sense there is more beneath the surface, and none of it is accessible to them without your permission. One of the most powerful shifts you can make is learning to be unavailable, not out of pettiness, not out of avoidance, but out of self-respect. Stoics taught the value of protecting your time, energy, and attention. Machiavelli taught that powerful people limit their access intentionally. When you are constantly available emotionally, mentally, physically, people begin to feel entitled to you. Being unavailable resets the hierarchy. Think about the people who drained you the most, the ones who always took but never gave, the ones who expected you to be their therapist, their emotional punching bag, their personal reassurance dispenser. Why did they expect that? Because you trained them to. Your availability became their crutch, and every time you explained yourself or justified your boundaries, you reinforced the idea that you owed them access. Marcus Aurelius said, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." When your life is filled with interruptions, demands, explanations, and emotional labor, your mind becomes stained with everyone else's issues. You lose your clarity. You lose your identity. You lose the energy you need for your own ambitions. Being unavailable isn't selfish, it's necessary for growth. Machiavelli warned rulers to guard their time and presence carefully. To appear too available diminishes perception of value. You become common, easily reached, easily used. When you create scarcity around your attention, people automatically value it more. Scarcity forces respect. Scarcity forces people to reconsider how they approach you. Scarcity reveals who truly deserves access. Being unavailable also means letting people solve their own problems instead of rushing in to rescue them. Many people rely on your explanations, your emotional support, your justification of their feelings, because it spares them from facing themselves. When you step back, they're forced to confront their own patterns. It may frustrate them, but it ultimately frees you. There's a story of a general who rarely attended meetings. He would send subordinates instead, and only appear when absolutely necessary. Because of this, every room shifted when he walked in, every voice lowered, every face turned. Why? Because his presence meant something. Your presence should also mean something, and it can't if it's constantly available. Being unavailable also teaches you to prioritize your inner world. Instead of explaining yourself outwardly, you begin listening inwardly. You cultivate stillness. You create boundaries around your mental space. You stop responding to everything as if it requires your involvement. This internal shift makes you both calmer and more capable, the Stoics' groundedness, paired with the Machiavellian's controlled presence. When you become less available, the right people remain and the wrong people fade. You gain respect not through force but through distance. And most importantly, you reclaim your life from the expectations of others. The less accessible you are, the more power you hold. Stoicism teaches that suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about them. Machiavelli teaches that emotions cloud judgment and expose weakness. Together, they form a philosophy that transforms emotional detachment into a superpower, not the cold absence of feeling, but the disciplined ability to feel without being controlled. There's a moment in every person's life when emotion has betrayed them, when anger sparked regret, when attachment led to heartbreak, when fear stopped an opportunity, when desire clouded logic. Emotional detachment protects you from those self-inflicted wounds. It is not the death of emotion but the refinement of it. It is mastery instead of slavery. Marcus Aurelius practiced emotional detachment every morning. He reminded himself that people would be selfish, rude, ungrateful, and irrational, and that none of it had the power to disturb him unless he allowed it. This practice gave him armor thicker than any steel. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone, because his emotions were not tossed by their storms. A Machiavellian ruler, on the other hand, used emotional detachment to outplay enemies. By appearing calm in chaos, steady in conflict, and unpredictable in pressure, they gained psychological advantage over everyone around them. People fear the person they cannot emotionally influence. They respect the person they cannot shake. They obey the person whose emotions remain unchanging. In your life, emotional detachment gives you the same edge. When people see they cannot guilt you, provoke you, manipulate you, or pressure you, they shift their behavior. They tread lighter. They treat you differently. You transform from someone they can control into someone they must negotiate with. That shift changes every relationship in your life. But emotional detachment is not avoidance. It is presence without panic. It is connection without dependency. It is love without losing yourself. It is clarity without reactivity. It gives you the power to stay anchored even when the world pulls at you. It allows you to walk away from toxic situations without needing to explain your side. There's a story of a Stoic teacher whose student was insulted publicly. The student demanded his teacher defend him, but the teacher simply said, "If the words do not apply to you, why be disturbed?" That's the level of detachment that frees you from the opinions of others. It is liberation through indifference. Emotional detachment doesn't make you cold, it makes you impossible to break. You feel fully, but you stay sovereign over your feelings. And when you own your emotions instead of outsourcing them, you become someone who commands respect without speaking a word. Silence in conflict is one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Most people rush to defend themselves, explain their intentions, or argue their viewpoint. But the Stoics practiced restraint while Machiavelli used silence as a form of psychological pressure. Together, these teachings reveal that your quiet confidence often wins battles your words never could. In conflict, silence forces the other person to reveal more. They speak longer, expose their agenda, contradict themselves, and reveal their emotional state. You gather information. They lose leverage. Your silence is not absence, it is surveillance. And because it is unexpected, it destabilizes the other party. Marcus Aurelius taught that anger and conflict are traps. When you remain silent, you do not step into the trap. You choose patience over impulse. You choose clarity over chaos. Silence gives you distance, and distance gives you perspective. Most arguments lose power when you stop feeding them your emotional response. Machiavelli noted that a leader should rarely reveal their full position during negotiations. The more the opponent talks, the more they expose. Silence becomes a negotiation tool. It makes people second-guess themselves. It makes them doubt their assumptions. It makes them fear that you know something they don't. Think of the last heated argument you witnessed. The person who stayed calm, who didn't raise their voice, who listened more than they spoke, always appeared stronger. Not because they dominated the conversation, but because they didn't lose themselves inside it. That's the essence of strategic silence. It protects your dignity while weakening theirs. There's a story about a general who received a letter filled with insults from a rival. Instead of responding, he placed the letter in a drawer. A week later, the rival apologized because the silence was more unsettling than any retaliation. Silence forces people to sit with their own words, and their imagination will punish them more than you ever could. Strategic silence is not avoidance but discipline. It says, "I am in control of myself, not controlled by you." People cannot escalate a conflict with someone who doesn't participate in escalation. They cannot manipulate someone who doesn't react. They cannot dominate someone who remains calm and unreadable. When you practice strategic silence, you stop fighting unnecessary battles. You stop losing energy to pointless drama. You stop justifying your decisions to people who aren't interested in understanding. Silence becomes your shield, your sword, your strategy, a calm that wins wars without raising your voice. Distance is one of the most powerful forms of psychological leverage. Stoics created emotional distance to protect their inner peace. Machiavelli created social distance to protect his authority. You need both. Distance gives you perspective, clarity, and power. It protects you from manipulation and keeps you grounded in your own identity. There are people in your life who only value you when you are near, when you're accessible, when you're explaining yourself, when you're giving them your attention. But the moment you create distance, their true intentions are revealed. Some chase you out of entitlement. Some disappear because they benefited from your availability. And some adjust because they respect boundaries. Marcus Aurelius constantly wrote about returning to himself. He said the mind must retreat into its own fortress. This wasn't isolation, it was recalibration. When you step back, you see yourself more clearly. You see others more clearly. You also see who is willing to meet you halfway. Distance exposes everything explanations try to hide. Machiavelli taught that rulers should avoid overexposure. Mystery elevates perception. Distance creates demand. When you don't share everything, when you don't explain everything, when you're not constantly present, people become curious. They start to wonder what occupies your attention. They begin to value your presence more because it's no longer a constant. Think of a time when someone pulled away from you slightly, didn't respond immediately, didn't overshare, didn't chase. Their distance probably made you pay more attention, not less. It made you wonder, question, reconsider. Distance alters power dynamics more effectively than confrontation ever could. Distance also protects your mind from emotional chaos. People's moods, insecurities, projections, and expectations no longer seep into your inner world. You begin to operate from a place of independence rather than emotional entanglement. Without distance, you get lost in other people's storms. With distance, you become the calm observer. There's a story of a Stoic philosopher who spent 1 week each month in solitude. During this time, he didn't explain his absence. He simply withdrew. When he returned, he was clearer, calmer, stronger. People respected him more for it, not less. Because distance builds authority when done with intention. Mastering the art of distance is mastering your relationship to yourself. It is choosing clarity over confusion, self-respect over people-pleasing, and purpose over validation. When you control your proximity, you control your influence. Be empowered today.